Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. On today's episode, I will be finishing up a late summer carp campaign on the bank of New Melones Reservoir. This reservoir in particular is one of the big three reservoirs here in Northern California, where targeting carp from the bank can be rather tricky. So follow me on this episode as I break down the area I am going to target. As for the rig, I am going to target this reservoir with a bolt rig because the area I'm targeting in particular has a very clean bottom. I will be using a panko pack bait mix, but the biggest difference is I will be spicing it up with the strawberry crush attractant from Nash. A lot of folks had often asked me about whether or not the strawberry jello does work. I am not a big fan of the strawberry jello. However, in the UK, a lot of these plume attractant are actually far superior to any of the powder mix that a lot of carp anglers use here in the United States, so it is just my preference. All I will do after I pack this bait on the lead is I will add this attractant on top of the hook bait. Not so much, but just enough because this stuff is extremely powerful. Now as for the area I am targeting, I have decided to target this very large back bay, which is relatively shallow from 5 to 10 feet. The reason I decided to target this shallow back bay instead of the deeper creeks is because the lake is on its drawdown phase. Prior to filming this episode, I ended up pre-fishing the lake about 2 different trips, and between the 2 different trips, I noticed that most of the larger fish were in this back bay versus the creeks. A lot of the smaller fish were loaded in the creeks, about 1 to 3 pounds, whereas the fish in this area were roughly anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds. So hopefully today I'm going to be able to show you guys a few really large specimens from this particular reservoir. I decided to place both rods near the middle of the bay where it is roughly about 10 feet of water. The bottom contour is rather flat and plain. There is some vegetation being blown by the wind, and later today there will be a light thunderstorm, but that's okay because I am anticipating that these fish will cooperate and I can get some great bites today. The sun was up high because it is near the middle of the day before I got this extremely violent bite on the right hand rod. I knew right away that I ended up hooking into a really nice fish. This fish was in probably about 8 to 9 feet of water at most. The late summer period is probably one of my least favorite times to target carp, especially larger carp, because more times than not a lot of these carp will often move out into the mouths of creeks. However, during my last 2 pre-fishing sessions, I ended up noticing that most of the fish that were out in those back creeks near the mouths of the creeks were actually much smaller grade of fish. So therefore, when I was moving around, I decided to target the back bay to see if this drawdown had any effect on whether or not these fish had moved into the back of the creeks. As it turned out, a lot of these larger fish chose to remain in these back bays. I'm not sure why, but I think maybe the drawdown had allowed them to access the bottom of these back bays for a better food source. Again, as for many of my European subscribers whom often criticize me for calling this a campaign despite not spending an entire season here at this reservoir, I am going to explain my take on American carp fishing. What a lot of European carp anglers don't realize is that carp will often be the biggest biomass of fish available in any of our North American freshwater system. Whether an angler is fishing a pond, a lake, a river, or even a small creek, the amount of carp available to any angler here is often more than all of Europe probably combined. And I am not exaggerating because there are many reservoirs where the carp will often end up dying off in the summer due to algae blooms. A great example here in Northern California is Clear Lake. So rather than waste my time on a specific body of water during an entire season targeting that specific body of water, I find that it is actually best served in my purpose to have a few pre-fishing sessions and then target a specific area once I find the grade of fish I would like to catch. That is my take on why I call it a campaign despite not fishing here for an entire season. This was a really nice fish from this reservoir, especially for the later part of summer. I'll take what I can get. More times than not, whenever I'm targeting this reservoir, especially during the later part of summer, I will catch a lot of 1 to 3 pound fish, so it is often a really rare treat for me to catch one above 10 pound from the bank. New Melones is notorious for producing some very healthy and chunky carp. I'm not sure why for a highland reservoir, but this reservoir does produce some really nice carp in my opinion. I'll show him to you guys real quick, and I'll let him rest up a bit before returning him to the water. Alright buddy, thanks for playing, and off you go. The rod on the left hand side ended up getting bit. The storm clouds were rolling in fast, so therefore I think a lot of these fish are going to turn on real soon. The weather pattern during the later part of summer here in Northern California can be rather unpredictable. I started this day session when the weather is nice and bright currently as it is now, but I know that based on the weather report, there is going to be some overcast and the possibility of a thunderstorm later this evening, so I will try and get as many bites as I can before the thunderstorm completely moves in. New Melones Reservoir can often be tricky to target carp from, especially when fishing from the bank. Depending on the time of year, location is key whenever targeting one of these large reservoirs. One of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of new carp anglers do out here in the United States is often targeting these large reservoirs where the carp are not present. A good advice I will give to any new carp anglers when targeting a large reservoir, especially those we have here in Northern California, is I like to just sit and observe the water just for about half an hour prior to setting up and starting fishing. I will actually bring my kit down to the edge of the water and give it a quick walk and just observe if there are any carp breaking the surface of the water or if there's any fish swimming near the bank. More times than not, an angler, by simply just walking around the target area, can often observe carp actively feeding or swimming, and this is a good sign to know before simply setting up and waiting in a specific area all day and not getting a bite. Another thing I really like to do as well is I like to pre-fish. I will often treat my carp campaign very similar to a bass fishing tournament, where I will pre-fish a few areas to figure out what grade of fish are in that area prior to filming these episodes. Hence why I call this a campaign, despite it being just a day session, because I have pre-fished this area already. I ended up landing this fish, and this was one very healthy fish. There's just something about this reservoir, New Melones, up in the mother lode, that produces these really nice carp. They are often much bigger, full fin, and very full body. This lake doesn't seem to have problems with some of those skinnier carps that are often found in reservoirs like Folsom Lake, where up in the river arm they tend to be very skinny. Alright buddy, rest up a bit and off you go. The storm is fast approaching despite it looking like I have bluebird skies. I see the storm clouds over the hilltop. The left-hand rod ended up getting bit. I am anticipating that with the storm coming in, maybe these fish will start feeding proactively. This carp was a much heavier fish. I can tell that this is a carp and not a catfish, because more times than not, in these particular areas, most of the channel catfish will be gone from these back bays. Because it is the late part of summer, many channel catfish will follow bait. For those guys that are wondering whether or not catfish can still be found in these back bays, especially during the later part of summer, yes, the only species of catfish that will often be found in these shallow back bays come late summer will be the bullhead species. There will often be some yellow bullhead, brown bullhead, and white catfish available in these back bays. However, today I am just targeting carp, but if there were some catfish around, more than likely it's going to be a white catfish. As I've mentioned already several times in many of my catfish and carp episodes, catfish and carp will often frequent the same area during the early spring and spring period. However, as summer approaches, whether it be early summer or midsummer or getting into late summer, they will divulge and go their own separate ways. When it comes down to channel catfish in particular, especially for the anglers targeting channel catfish out here in Northern California, late summer means an angler should be targeting catfish that are looking for bait. When an angler finds bait, more than likely there will be catfish around. So for the guys that are wondering whether or not channel catfish can still be caught in areas where carp are holding, more times than not it will be a solid no. Hopefully that explains my take on how earlier in the season I'm able to catch catfish and carp in the same area, whereas during later in the season I won't be able to catch the same numbers of fish holding in the same area. This carp was fighting exceptionally well. I figure maybe the water is warmer, so these fish are fighting at their max capacity, whereas earlier in the year, especially early spring when the water is still cold, these fish often won't have much fight in them. Whereas currently right now during the later part of summer, when the water is very warm, these fish often fight very well. This was one very chunky carp. Somehow the bolt rig ended up hooking him on top of the head. This is very strange because more times than not when a carp ends up picking the bait, they'll often spit out the bait and end up getting hooked on the bottom of the jaw. However, this carp must have been rummaging around the bottom, thus kicking up a lot of debris for the hook to end up hooking him on top of the head. But I will net him and I will show him to you guys real quick. Maybe that is why he was fighting so well in the first place, because he was hooked on top of the head. This was one really round carp. Judging from his belly, this fish was feeding very well. He's actually one of the bigger fish in girth that I've caught recently from this reservoir. A lot of fish from this reservoir tend to be on the longer, leaner side, whereas this fish, however, was actually quite round. He fought very well nonetheless, and I think he's very cool looking as well. Alright buddy, I'll prep you for release. Rest up a bit and off you go. The rod on the left hand side ended up getting bit. As the day progressed, I noticed that as the storm clouds started moving in, the fish started biting a whole lot much more than usual. What I have found is during the late summer period, I really don't like to target the main body of the reservoir. The reason for this is because more times than not in many of my past fishing trips, the main body of the reservoir when carp fishing during the late summer period will often produce a lot much smaller grade of fish, because more times than not a lot of the fish that were born in the spring will become fingerlings this time of year, meaning that they will average anywhere between 6 to 10 inches and they'll often peck the bait apart, whereas I've noticed a distinct pattern that many of the adult fish will often move upstream either to a creek or a small river arm. Especially New Melones Reservoir, the reservoir I'm fishing today, will often have adult fish this time of year up in the creeks. However, I think because of the drawdown, many of these adult carp had chose to remain in the back bay as the water recedes and they peck away on the bottom, rummaging for whatever vegetation is currently left. That is just my theory, however, based on the last 2 pre-fishing trip I had at this reservoir. The drawdown this year wasn't as bad as many years in the past because we are not in a drought, whereas during the drought years, many of these fish will not be available in the back bays, especially during the later period of summer. As this carp approached the bank, I noticed that this fish had the telltale sign of a struggle with an otter. Out here on the west coast, there are only 3 things that can basically take on a carp in many of our freshwater system. Either it's an otter, an osprey, or angler shooting at them with a bow. Carp will often have no predators out here on the west coast of the United States. This carp bore the telltale sign that an otter tried to grab him on top of the gill plate. More times than not, when an otter attacks a carp, they are going to try and attack it behind the head around the gill to try and sever its swimming connection with the spine. However, this fish was probably too big for the otter, thus during the struggle, he ended up escaping. I'll show him to you guys real quick and I'll return him back to the lake. You are one lucky fellow, dude. I was setting up the bike camera and the rod on the right hand side ended up getting bit. The moment I picked up the rod, I knew right away that this was not a carp, but a white catfish, or a bullhead species of some kind. Unlike a channel catfish that will begin to death rolls, white catfish will often fight like a very small carp. They'll run side to side, and they're not as powerful as their cousin the channel catfish, but they are very fun on light tackle nonetheless. I've made an episode on white catfish in the past fishing at Lake Berryessa, but New Melones Reservoir is also notorious for producing great numbers of white catfish. White catfish will often continue to roam around these back bays all the way throughout into even late fall. I'll show this guy to you guys real quick, and contrary to popular belief, these fish do actually make for great eating. Maybe one day I'll make a catch and cook on this species. However, YouTube has been acting weird, so they've been censoring and demonetizing a lot of videos where blood is shown. But maybe one day I'll show you guys how to cook this species. The left hand rod ended up getting bit, and I knew right away that this was a carp. This carp peeled off so much line that he ended up getting the bite indicator stuck in the rod guide. However, I managed to get the bite indicator off, and I knew right away that this indeed was a very good fish. I often get quite a bit of questions about whether or not braid is good for carp fishing. Yes, braid is great for carp fishing. I have used braid in some of my past videos when carp and catfish fishing, and I use braid exclusively whenever I'm catfish fishing. I don't mind using braid, however, braid is just expensive when I'm carp fishing. Where I can, if I don't need a far cast, I will fish with mono, because mono is cheap and it is very abrasive resistant. If I were to lose a large amount of line, I can quickly spool up with the mono I carry on me. I can get 300 yard of monofilament line for less than $20, whereas braid, I could barely get 150 yards of braid for $20. So in my opinion, it is just much more inexpensive to fish with mono, where an angler don't need the sensitivity or the far cast. Hopefully that clarifies why sometimes you guys will see me fish with braid when I'm fishing for both species, catfish and carp, and then sometimes you guys will see me fish monofilament line for just carp. The monofilament I prefer to use is Sunline. The reason I like Sunline over a lot of monofilament that are traditionally made in the United States is because this Japanese style monofilament gives me just the right amount of stretch and the diameter is pretty thin, so therefore I'm able to load up on much heavier line with thinner diameter, and it also makes for easy management as well. I often will respool, especially around 2 to 3 months, whereas the memory on this monofilament, these Japanese monofilament style, especially made by Sunline, aren't as bad as those made in the United States. Using braided line will often avoid the troubles of having the monofilament line contain memory, but the biggest problem with braid is just the cost. More times than not, what I see a lot of new anglers will do is they'll often give the braided line a very far cast when carp or catfish fishing, and when they get hung up, they'll often just end up cutting the line. They'll end up losing anywhere from 25 to 30 yards of line, and I just think that is just a horrible waste of money. But my advice to the guys that are worried about line is fish whatever you guys have. I have caught these fish on both monofilament line and braided line. They have both served their purposes, and I've landed hundreds of fish on them. This fish was very round and very healthy, probably one of the healthiest fish I've caught this year from this reservoir. He was kind of pudgy and very round, telling me that he is actually very well fed. Unlike many of those other carp that I've caught up here in the mother lodes, this fish was not lean at all. I'll show him to you guys real quick, and I'll get him prepped for a release. I'll let the fish rest up a bit, and then when he's healthy, I'll let him swim off. Alright buddy, off you go. The storm was moving in fast as evening approaches. The rod on the left hand side ended up getting a very violent bite. This fish actually took off with the bait so fast that I ended up not even realizing that it was going off for a minute. As the clouds rolled in, I noticed that the pace of the bites were getting a lot much quicker. I think it is because of the overcast as the storm started to roll in that these fish were beginning to feed a lot much more aggressively. A lot of my European subscribers often ask me how come I don't feed the fish prior to just fishing the session. Well, I've already answered this question several times in the past. I live in the United States, out here on the West Coast, in California, where chumming these freshwater bodies of water is actually illegal. Feeding the fish, or here in the United States we call it chumming, is actually illegal here in many of our freshwater bodies of water. The only areas we are allowed to chum out here in California are certain sections of the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River that is below the I-80 bridge and the I-5 bridge, and the chum cannot be composed of corn. Corn can however be used in the pack bait or on the hook bait, but it cannot be used to openly feed fish. I've mentioned this several times in many of my previous videos. In Europe, a lot of anglers prior to fishing will feed the area, or here in the United States we will call it chumming. In many parts of the United States, especially those out Midwest and deep south, chumming is no issue when it comes down to carp and catfish fishing. However, out here on the West Coast and sometimes in the Pacific Northwest and some of those other northeastern states, chumming can be illegal, so the only way many anglers can get around these laws is to use pack bait. Because pack bait and dip bait fall underneath the same category, some anglers will often ask me what is dip bait. Dip bait is a very popular form of bait used for catfish fishing, and it is very similar to pack bait. The only difference is because you are dipping a contraption with a hook into this very thick gunky cheese concoction, sometimes smelling very bad, for catfish fishing. Just like pack bait, once the dip bait is casted out and when it hits the bottom of the water, it will slowly dissipate, allowing the catfish to navigate to the hook and where the contraption is laid. It is the same concept as pack bait. So that is just one of the main biggest difference between fishing in Europe and the United States. We have some very different laws despite just being across the pond from each other. Out here on the United States, an angler will often seldom find another carp angler. The only other carp anglers out here will often be the bow fishing guys, and they are not fishing rod and reel. They are actually shooting the carp. So hopefully my European subscribers will quit giving me flack about why I call things a campaign and why I don't have the same kit many Europeans carry. This was another very nice carp, not as big, but well above 10 pounds. While I got this fish on the mat, the right hand rod went off. I ended up having a double hookup now. With the other fish on the landing mat, I was quite pleasantly surprised that this fish actually got hooked pretty well, because I didn't really let him run off completely with the bolt rig, so I didn't think he got hooked very well, but I ended up noticing that he was actually much closer to me. I know that carp fishing isn't very popular with my American subscribers and viewers, but I often get quite a bit of some European subscribers and viewers whom often ask me about how carp fishing in the United States isn't popular. My opinion on the matter is the fact that many Americans often still view fishing as a form of catch and take home for consumption. What a lot of my European subscribers and viewers don't realize is that the United States of America is a huge country. Contrary to popular beliefs, there are only a handful of states that will border the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, or now known as the Gulf of America. These states will have access to saltwater fish, whereas many of the landlocked states will only still have access to whatever freshwater fishes that are available to take home for the table. Every state, depending on the region, will also have attitudes based on the freshwater fishes or saltwater fishes available for taking home for human consumption. For example, out here on the West Coast, the most coveted fish by far is the Chinook salmon. Whereas if an angler were to move out into the middle part of America, or what I call the landlocked state, something like a Wisconsin, then the most coveted fish will probably be either panfish species or the walleye. Historically speaking, carp did serve its purpose as a food fish for many American tables up until after World War II. Many households after World War II experienced an economic boom, thus removing carp from the American table. It served its purpose as a food fish from after the Grant administration, from the Reconstruction era, all the way till World War II. Only then did the attitude change that carp was no longer a food fish, but rather a rough fish, or some states will even call them a trash fish. I ended up landing this second fish, and now I have two fish in the net. Both were of equal size, and in my opinion, were very gorgeous, full scale, and full of colors. I'll show this fish that I just landed to you guys real quick. These fish are extremely healthy, especially from this reservoir. For some odd reason, I find that New Melones produce some of the most healthiest carp out here on the mother lode lakes. This first fish that I landed before I was interrupted by that second fish was about the same size, and he was very healthy nonetheless as well. I'll show him to you guys real quick, and I'll get both of them prepped and returned to the water. He was very angry nonetheless, and didn't really want to pose. I always carry a landing mat in the event that the fish want to flop itself out, because at the end of the day, I am practicing catch and release, so I want to release many of these fish back into the water in the same conditions, or as close as I can to when I caught them. Alright guys, off you guys go. Late summer in Northern California is really unpredictable. One moment I started the day when it had bluebird sky, and now the overcast is here. I could hear the thunderstorm rolling out in the distance. The right hand rod ended up getting bit as I was baiting the left hand rod. This was not a carp however, but another white catfish. White catfish are very opportunistic. I've caught them on a multitude of bait. And more times than not, when I'm carp fishing, I will always pick up a handful of white catfish, especially during the summer periods. Generally speaking, white catfish will often not stray from the same area that they will use to spawn, especially during the early spring period. They can be caught on a wide variety of baits and are often the easiest catfish species to be caught by many new catfish anglers or young anglers alike. This fish was hooked right in the corner of the jaw because more times than not, these fish will make roving maneuvers prior to committing to the bait. I'll show him to you guys real quick, and I'll get him returned to the water. You are one lucky fellow I'm not doing a catch and cook with you. I finally got both rods out rebaited, and the left hand rod ended up getting bit. This was a much better fish. To my surprise, the storm was causing these fish to bite quite erratically. At first I thought maybe it died off after that double hookup because I didn't get bit for another half hour, but this fish showed up. So I can't fully confirm whether or not the storm is causing the bites to be off or on. At first I thought maybe the bites were on, but after it died off for a little, the bites came back on. Late summer fishing can be just so erratic when fishing from the bank. This is one of the biggest problems as a bank angler that I've noticed throughout my many years of fishing during the late summer period. Unlike the fall, where a lot of the fish will be concentrated, late summer can be rather quite erratic. There are some group of carp out there on the creek arms and the river channels, and there are just still some carp out in the bay. I originally thought I was going to focus this campaign out on the creek channels, but due to the last pre-fishing trips I had, the grade of fish out on those creeks were just a whole lot smaller. I was anticipating that the bigger fish were going to be out on this back bay still, but I was just pleasantly surprised on that third trip I had that many of these larger fish continue to stay out on the back bay. So I decided to conclude this campaign out on the back bay, where traditionally I would only fish these back bays during the early spring and spring periods. Another factor that I thought helped a lot this year was the golden mussel closure. What I've noticed since the golden mussel closure is the lack of pleasure boaters out on many of these larger reservoirs that are kind of out of the way. New Melones Reservoir, for some strange reason I believe, is kind of out of the way and is not as popular as those out near urban population centers like Sacramento, which ended up having Folsom Lake taking on the brunt of the water recreational users. Just like the Delta, the city of Stockton currently has most of the water recreational users out on the Delta. I had a carp campaign out on Lake Berryessa during the middle part of summer, and that lake had also taken on quite a bit of water recreational users as well. But New Melones, for some strange reason, currently does not have the same number of water recreational users like Lake Berryessa. As I was bringing the fish I just netted to the landing mat, the rod on the right hand side ended up getting bit. I wasn't expecting a second fish so soon, and now I'm in the same situation as earlier. I got another double hookup, and this bite was just so erratic today. This second carp took off like a freight train onto the right hand side, where I have the first fish currently on the landing mat. I'm not exactly sure what was going on today. The fish were here and they were feeding very erratically. One moment I had quite a bit of rapid succession of bites, and one moment it was just dead. But I'm extremely happy that today's campaign was actually a whole lot much better than the last campaign I had out on Lake Berryessa, where literally the lake looked like an armada of water skiers and jet skiers. So I'm just extremely happy today that I was able to fish in peace. The golden mussel closure had forced a lot of watercraft anglers to pretty much be stuck to their local bodies of waters that they've gotten their watercraft banded to. But for the bank anglers, this can be either a curse or a blessing. Depending on the body of water you are fishing, it can either be a complete disaster and chaos, or it can be solid, serene, and quiet. I'm conducting this campaign on a weekend, and so far today I've only seen 3 water recreational user and 1 fisherman. It was very quiet indeed, and I was pleasantly surprised. I'm currently avoiding Lake Berryessa and Folsom Lake on the weekends. Those lakes I've had some experience during the middle part of summer with, and they are just complete chaos with the sheer number of water recreational users out there, and some brave anglers that are going out early morning and returning by mid-morning to avoid the chaos on the launch ramps. For some strange reason, a lot of my subscribers and viewers are obsessed with Folsom Lake. I've broken Folsom Lake down this year and last year about the spring period, and last year about the late summer period. You can find them on my channel underneath the late summer catfish fishing videos. I have an episode out there from last year, and the concept is the same for those guys that are still asking me about Folsom Lake. The only reason I haven't gone out there this year again is because the sheer number of water recreational folks that are currently out there. I know everyone's supposed to cope with each other and coexist, but as a bank angler and content creator, it's extremely annoying to try and film with folks screaming and the sound of motors running all over the place. In my opinion, that just doesn't make for very good content, and on this channel I try to produce the best content I can for my subscribers and viewers both alike, whether subscribed or not. I ended up landing the second fish, but for some strange reason, the first fish decided he wanted to flop away as well, so I ended up pushing him back into the net, and now I have 2 carp again. They lost some scales during the struggle, but that's okay. Carp are very hardy, and they will survive. This was another very healthy carp. This was the carp that ended up interrupting while I just barely put that first fish on the mat. He was very healthy and robust nonetheless, full of fin and full of colors. This first fish that I ended up landing lost some scales during the struggle, but he was very healthy and very full fin as well. These fish are quite robust and healthy, especially from New Melones Reservoir. This reservoir gets virtually zero pressure when it comes down to the catfish and carp fishing. Alright buddy, rest up a bit and off you go. I'll get your buddy back in the water as well. He was a little bit non-cooperative, but after a bit he found his way, so I'll get this second fish in the water as well. This fish was a little bit dazed, but after a little bit of rest, he found his way out back into the water. Alright dude, off you go as well. Overall, it was just a great conclusion to my new Melones carp campaign. Today was quite the success, and I didn't anticipate that the bites were going to be so erratic, but nonetheless, I caught quite a handful of fish for the camera. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, tight lines y'all.